Okay, let's go. So we're up to Shin Yud Aleph. We're working our way through the halachas of Meis and Muktzah on Shabbos. Some very interesting halachas today. Yesh mi she'omer, Sif Gimel, we're up to. So Shin Yud Aleph, Sif Gimel. Yesh mi she'omer, she'im nosen ala Meis echod mikelin shehu lavush. If you put on the Meis an item of clothing that the Meis is wearing, choshev konosin kikar a tinoik. That's as if you've got a kikar, a loaf of bread or a tinoik, and therefore you can move the Meis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hainu shehoya hameis lavush by mitchila, i.e., the Meis was dressed and he was wearing some form of clothing. And certainly, if you put anything else, a kli shemelach teleheta, such as a kikar, a tinoik, or anything else. Okay, and then Daled, Yesh Misha Omesh Lehitzrichu Kikar Etinak El Meis Oram. The whole idea of a kikar etinak, there are those who say that only applies to a Meis who is not wearing any clothes. But if he is wearing clothes, Ein Sorech Kikar Etinak, then you don't even need it because you've got the clothes. So why is that different to Sif Gimel? So it says Mishnah Berurah Tezayin Sif Zeh Hoisif Afilu Im Hameis Lovush By Achshov. Even if the clothes that he's currently wearing, that helps like a kikar tinuk, and you don't have to put on extra clothing. Well, Beis Yosef Hikshalzer, the Beis Yosef asks, surely the clothing of the Meis is going to be bottled to him, and therefore it's insignificant, and it shouldn't count as a kikar tinuk. The dafka tachrichin heim b'tein etzlei. Dafka tachrichin, that the shrouds that the Meis wears, a bottle, she'ena osid lefasham, because you're not changing out of them. Aval hamalbushin she'en lovish bom mechaim, but the clothes that he was wearing whilst he was still alive, bevadai osid lafshitan me'olov, they're certainly going to be taken from him, ve'im b'tein leza, and therefore they're not bottled. He's not overly happy with this answer. Okay. Yossi, I think this was the point you mentioned yesterday. If you need the place where the Meis is currently occupying, or the place upon which the Meis is resting, you're allowed to move the Meis minatzad, not directly, in other words. You move him from the bed to another bed. Because you're doing it, which is allowed. And this whole idea of a kikar etinak is only allowed for the Meis, but not other items of muktzah. Okay, it says in Mishnah Berurah Yud Zayin, Dova hamuta, Rotzelema, she'ein kavanosa b'tziltzula b'shvil ha-Meis gufa, shehu also b'tziltzula. You can't move the Meis for the Meis itself because that's not allowed. Ela b'shvil ha-mokum ha'adova shehu munach olav. You're doing it for the place that he's occupying. Shehu muta b'tziltzula. That would make it muta. Avol, but kikar, what's that going on? Yudches. But kikar tinuk is only an eitzah for the Meis, not for any other form of muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Yudches Ayin Le'el b'sim Shinches Sif Hey Mishnah Berurah Sham Sif Cotton Chavov. So thankfully we have the Dish of Mishnah Berurah who summarizes it for us. In 15 he says Kosav Sham HaShulchan Aruch Sheyesh Matir L'Taltel Kli Shemelach Tel'isa Mecham L'Tzel Al Yedei Kikar Tinuk. So he's got a bit of a problem because previously the Mishnah Berurah said you are allowed to move Kli Shemelach Tel'isa Mecham L'Tzel Al Yedei Kikar Tinuk. So for example, I don't know, you've got an ironing board which you left outside, which is a kli shemelach tel'isa, and you're worried it's being damaged by the sun or something like that. If you put a kikar on it, you can put it back in. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says previously. Because the Mishnah Berurah sham shehar b'rishonim cholku al zeh, but the Mishnah Berurah says that many rishonim argue that, or kamoisam ichriu har b'achronim, and achronim agree. Achein b'mokum hefsem merubah because b'shatzian b'shem shulchan aruch harav sheish lahakol b'zeh. So, and that's consistent with what we're saying over here, i.e. the whole heta of kikar tinuk is only for Meis, and really to use it for any other form of muktzah, the Shatzian says, V'makom hefsed merubah, it would be allowed, but otherwise not. Okay, Si'if Vov. Meis hamutal b'chama. Now this is very interesting. We'll see in the footnotes, the Meis hamutal b'chama in this Sif and in the next Sif, what can be done for a mace who is exposed, and we're worried Shema Yasriach, and he'll talk in the footnotes about what actually happened to the Chazon Ish, who was nift on a Friday night. And the minhag nowadays is you take the mace, you put it on the floor, there should be Masriach. So we'll see the various applications of this. Meis hamutal b'chama. So you've got a mace which is it's in the sun. Ve'ein lohem mokum letaltalei, and there's nowhere to move the mace, as in the aforementioned ways. For whatever reason you don't want to move the mace, but and we're worried that it's exposed to the sunlight, and therefore Shema Yasriach. So what do you do? So the Mechaber, based on the Gemara, comes up with the following idea. Two people come along and they sit on either side of the mace. Chom lohem milamato. And then it's hot because they're sitting on the floor is hot. So what happens? Each guy say, it's a bit warm, sitting on the hot ground, and each one brings a bed. Okay, but then it gets hot from above, the sun is beating down. So this one brings a mat, like a sort of a sunscreen, or Peres al Gabov, and he puts it on top of him. Or Peres al Gabov, and the other one does the same. Now, then the first guy takes his bed and slips it away. He's allowed to move, doesn't have to be there the whole of Shabbos. And the other guy does the same. And then what have you got left? You've got two machatzolos left covering over the mace. Because the two mats are sort of touching each other, very close to each other. And they're both sort of resting or somehow on the ground. And therefore you've got some sort of protection for the mace, and that is a sort of a neat way of doing it. Says the Mishnah Berurah Sivkot and Yutes, Zeh mevi mitosei, kadei lehefsik beinom lekarka. So as I said, you're putting it on the ground. Ve'ein lahakshos, and you can't ask, given the lebesoif zeikiv mitosei, or masir achakach. At the end of the day, you're putting the bed there, and then you're removing it to a chudilakame. V'nisharak hamachseles prusal mace, and what you're left with is the mat, or the screen, which is protecting the mace. Just save yourself a lot of trouble and just put the machatzeles there in the first place. Why do you have to bring the mitzvah first and then the machatzeles? Because at the end of the day, you bring the mitzvah, then you bring the machatzeles, then you move the mitzvah away. So just bring the machatzeles, finished. If you just bring the machatzeles, then it's more apparent that you're doing it for the benefit of the mace, and we don't want that. For osalasos oil arai letzorech hameis, and you can't just make an oil arai for the benefit of the mace. But now you'll bring the bed for your benefit because the floor is hot. Then because when it's hot from underneath, you're bringing a bed. And people, the onlooker, will say, Mistama is bringing the machatzeles as well for his own benefit. Okay. Chaf, zoykef mitosoi v'nishmat, rotzolema, shezoykfa umeisira, v'hu nishmat mitachas hamachzeles. So what does that mean? In other words, you put up your bed, and then you remove it, v'nishmat mitachas hamachzeles, and you sort of slip it away from underneath the screen, v'machzeles hem koshim v'zkufim, and the screens are sort of sturdy, and they're standing up straight, v'nishar memela ko'el al meis, and therefore memela, they're staying on top of the mace. If you're worried that if you're worried, you're worried that maybe the mace will be matzriach and you've got to go, you're allowed, if there's no other way, to bring a machatzeles, some sort of screen, so long as you're not making a proper oil. Okay, that's the end of that. Zayin. Okay, we'll do one more sif. Mutza losu chameis, and now we're coming to the story of the Chazon Ish. Mutza losu chameis v'lahadicha. You're allowed to anoint the oil, the mace. The sicha is always with oil, and hadicha is with water. So losu chameis v'lahadicha v'lishma it hakar mitachtov, and take away the cushion which is underneath him. Shelo yasriach, so that the mace won't decay. Or bilvad. But you'll be careful not to move any limb of the mace. And if the piv is, the mouth of the mace is open and is sort of increasingly opening, You're allowed to sort of tie the lechi, the cheekbone, and the jaw in a way that it won't increase, it won't open further. So it's partially open, and you're worried that it's going to open further, and there's like a bizoyin for the mace. You're allowed to tie it in that way. But you can't close it. So if it's partially open, it can stay in that position, but you can't close it. Because otherwise you're moving a limb of the mace, which you're not allowed to do. And for the same reason, you can't close the eyes of the mace on Shabbos. Okay, it says Mishnah Berurah. Chof Aleph. Like I said, so sicha is with oil and hadoch is with water. V'hainu b'mayim korim. It's with cold water. And you're allowed to apply the oil or the water onto the mace because that's just nagia, that's just touching the mace, and you're not moving him. And we've said many times that with muktzah, the issa is to move, but to just touch, it's okay. Chof beis mitachtov. So too, you can move the cushion from underneath the mace. But you can't move the mace off the cushion. She'll tilt to mamish because that's just proper tiltal. That's proper moving a mace. A muktzah. And the minhag is we move the mace off the cushions by way of a kikar tzinok, by putting something on the mace. For yesh, even in a situation where we're not worried shemi yasriach. So in other words, if there's a mace in a bed on Shabbos, just leave him there. If you're not worried shemi yasriach, and especially if it's late in the afternoon on Shabbos afternoon, there's no real concern of shemi yasriach. Then the best thing is to leave him there, because there is a minhag in some people. They move the mace even b'makom she'en lochash yasriach, even in a situation where we're not worried that it will decay or be masriach. V'yesh limchus biyodam, and you should protest against that. Rak lishmei takar mitachtov mutar, but just moving the karm underneath him would be mutar. 21. V'chein legabe, footnote 21. V'chein legabe pshitas begodim me'ameis b'Shabbos. And so too, if you want to take off some clothes of the mace on Shabbos, kosav b'shal shuva shevet halevi, she'af al pi shekosav ha'kaf ha'chaim b'shem ha'pesach ha'dvir, she'aminag ha'chevra kadisha b'kilas Izmir. There is a minhag of the certain chevra kadisha in a place called Izmir. Hayal lefoishtam kadesh le'asriach. Their minhag was to take the clothes off the mace so that the mace wouldn't be masriach. And they would do the same thing in the winter months, and they won't be, they don't distinguish between the hot season and the cold season. Why? Because they were concerned that all times of the year maybe there'll be masriach. But at the end of the day, the halacha is not that, and that you shouldn't sort of derobe the mace on Shabbos, because the concern is you're going to move the limbs of the mace. So the Chazan Ish died on a Friday night, and they say that they didn't take off any of his clothing in order of Shemer Yasriach because of this concern. And if you look at the next paragraph, the last line, he says, "Kosav b'shal shuva shevet halevi sheksheniftach Chazan Ish, when the Chazan Ish passed away, rak hitziu es hakar shahayamunuch mitachas reishay." All they did was they took away the pillow that was underneath the head of the Chazan Ish, v'chisol b'sadin, and they covered him with a sheet. Kamashmo is divrei Mishnah Berurah, exactly what the Mishnah Berurah says. So in other words, exactly what the Mishnah Berurah said is what they did to the Chazan Ish. The Chazan Ish died on a Shabbos. They took away the cushion from underneath his head, but they didn't take off any items of clothing out of concern Shemi Yasriach, because the Mishnah Berurah says that one shouldn't do that. And even though there are Chevra Kadishas who have that minhag, the Mishnah Berurah says you should protest against it because it's not ideal. Mistama, the Shevet Halevi, he was close to the Chazan Ish, and he must have, maybe he was there b'shas B'tziras, I'm not sure. Okay. All right, let's carry on. We're 4 or 5 lines into the Mishnah Berurah and Chaf Aleph. Over mixas mekaymes nagin lahatzim einov or liyashe evarov shelo yisakmu. In some places, we close the eyes and we straighten the limbs of the mace shelo yisakmu, because rigor mortis sets in, and therefore if the limbs are in a strange position, then it's hard to move them after that. V'oimrim de'isa b'zoya she's sakana, and apparently the Zoya says there is a sakana for the limbs to be in a funny position. Even though this is not brought in mainstream halacha, the Mishnah issa de'ein matzim le'ein of shames, because the Mishnah says you're not allowed to close the eyes of a mace on Shabbos. V'chein shelo yazis by aver, nor should you move a limb. V'chol rishonim sosmu kain, and all the rishonim conclude that you shouldn't move an aver or close the eyes of a mace on Shabbos. In a place where they do have that minhag, ein limchos, you shouldn't protest. Because there is a you can rely on this zohar. Now in 22 he says an important klal. So you've got a clash. On one hand you've got the zohar saying you should move the limbs, and you've got the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch and Poskim saying you shouldn't move the limbs. So what do you do when there's a clash between Teres Hanista and Teres Hanigla? So the rule is Ula'el Kosav the Mokum Shebali HaKabbalah v'divrei HaZohar Cholkim ala Gemara v'divrei HaPoskim Yesh Lino Kemuv b'Gemara Poskim. We go with the Teres Hanigla. That's a good klal to remember. It comes up from time to time. Whenever there's a clash between Teres Hanis and Teres Hanigla, we go with Teres Hanigla.
Sakana means sakana to the neshama. I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't know.
Wait,
hold off, because look at the next few words. Ach be'emes bezoya lo nizka sakana ki im le'inyan einayim. Now sakana, I don't know what that means exactly. Mistama to the neshama. But the Zohar actually says the Mishnah Berurah, that the sakana is only regarding closing the eyes, and therefore the Zohar allows you to close the eyes on Shabbos. V'imkein liyashe hevarim ein lohem shum smach. But to move the limbs, it's not based on the Zohar, because the Zohar is talking about eyes. Be'eli Rabbi Kosav the mokum shenagin lahakal b'zeh mishum shechoshin shleis akmu v'yu b'zoyin lemeis. If the limbs are in a funny position, and your cheshish there's a bizoyin lemeis, yasu kameshe kosav b'Mordechai, then you can do like the Mordechai says, shemaniach kika aisha dova shemut l'taltel, and you can do the eights of the kicker of the tinok on top of the mace. And you sort of press on until you sort of straighten out the limbs. You can do it sort of derech agav. If you look at 23. He says an interesting point. To tell a non-Jewish person to straighten the limbs, that's allowed. That would be allowed. Okay, let's just finish off. Chaf Gimel. Because we're worried if the mace is put on cushions or there's covers on him, he might be matzriach, he might decay. You can put vinegar on the begodim of the mace, bishvil shelo yasriach l'matzei Shabbos v'yuchlu yitzasik b'tara, so they can do the tara straight away. Shelo yaziz v'im hoy hameis muluch batit. If, however, the mace sadly was covered in dirt, v'tzoya or excrement ad shemos be'enei royav, and it's disgusting in the eyes of those who see him. Mutar l'talta de kika v'tinik l'rochza b'mayim b'yoda. You're allowed to move the mace by way of a kicker or tinuk and wash him b'mayim b'yoda. You can actually physically wash him. V'lo al yidei mapa mishum schita, but don't use a cloth because you've got other issues of schita. Ava b'lav hachi also b'chol zeh v'afilu al yidei en Yehudi osi, and otherwise to do it by way of en Yehudi would not be allowed. Okay, so just to summarize. So we've said there are various ways to move a mace on Shabbos. There's kika etinoik, that's the classic way. There's also tilta min atzad, and we've said today that there are various things that you can do to protect or clean the mace. So, for example, if there are those who say that if there is wearing clothes, then the clothes are considered a kicker or tinuk, and therefore you can move it. Either the clothes he's wearing, or perhaps even certainly to add on an item of clothing that would function. Any item which is not muksa, you can put on like a kicker or tinuk. Then we said that a mesu is mutal b'chama. You've got this clever way of moving beds there and screens and whatever, and then you just move the beds away and the screens remain so that you can protect the mace. that it won't be exposed to the sun. And then we said that you shouldn't move any avarim of the mace, even though the Zohar says if the mace has got limbs which are in a funny position or his eyes are open, you're allowed to move it. In halacha, we don't do that. We follow the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, which says that you should not move the limbs of the mace. If, however, by getting a non-Jew to do it, that would be okay. Or if there is a bizoyan to the mace, then you can take a car and you can press down a limb. That would be allowed. So regarding the Chazon Ish, apparently he was nifta on Friday night, and what they did with him is they followed the rulings of the Mishnah Berurah, i.e. they didn't remove any items of clothing out of concern Shem Yasrech, but rather they just moved the cushion from under his head because that makes it more warm, and that was the limit as to what they did. Okay, say that.